Judge not, that you be not judged. For with that judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye, hypocrite? First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, if he asks his son for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father, who is in heaven, give good things to those who ask him? Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets.
Amen. Thank you very much. And as we think about those verses, whether you've grown up in church or not, you've probably heard phrases that were mentioned there. The first one, just as it starts out, judge not, that you be not judged. Have you ever heard a phrase like that? Have you used a phrase like that? And you may not have even known that it came from here in the Sermon on the Mount, from the words of Jesus, or even about asking and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. We may use a phrase like that. And then probably maybe one of the most familiar is right there at the very end of in verse 12, where it says, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Well, we've heard the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Now, the problem with that, or not the problem with that, but the problem with us is how do we typically treat others? Well, it's actually do unto others as they have done unto me, right? If they've treated me wrong, well, I'm going to treat them in kind. If they've treated me good, well, I'm going to treat them in kind. Well, Jesus already looked at that. We already looked at that a few weeks ago at the end of chapter 5. But as we look at these phrases, in verse 12, it starts out, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Now, anytime you come to a verse that says therefore, that word therefore is linking the verses before to what he's about to say. Because of what we've just looked at, because of what we've just said, now I want you to understand this. And so as we look, probably the biggest part that we'll be looking at this morning is the part about judge not, that you be not judged. But why should we do that? Why should we not judge? Well, with that very principle, how do you want people to treat you? So we ought to treat them in the same manner. Now, we live in a world that is very judging, right? How many of you would say there are a lot of judgmental people? Now, I'm going to ask another question. If you raised your hand, are you speaking about yourself or are you judging other people? See, I caught you. A trick question. You got to be very careful. And what's interesting, I did a little bit of looking up how many thoughts we have in a day and how many are negative or critical of others. Well, they say that the average person has 6,000 thoughts per day. Now you ask, well, how do they figure that out? Well, it says according to a 2020 study using brain imaging techniques. So techniques that they're monitoring the brain and watching the brain waves, I guess. So if you break that down, even giving a 16-hour day, 8 hours of sleep, you figure out 375 thoughts per hour, 6.25 a minute, which is basically a new thought every 10 seconds, which is reasonable, right? Now, it's also mentioned a large percentage are repetitive or negative. Some estimates say 60 to 80% of our thoughts are negative. That's scary, isn't it? Now, regarding judgmental or critical thoughts about others, some cognitive psychology studies suggest around 10 to 20% of our daily thoughts involve social comparisons, evaluations, and criticisms of others. 10 to 20%. That means 600 to about 1,200 of our daily thoughts have some type of judgmental, comparative, or critical thought towards another person. That's scary. And it's, well, to think that's how I think about other people. And we recognize this. In a sense, I've mentioned it in the past, we almost have a built-in scanner as soon as we see somebody. We walk into a room, and our minds, our eyes are constantly scanning everything. Our thoughts are constantly rolling. And as we scan people, well, there's an element that is healthy because we're scanning for danger. We're looking around. Is it safe? Are they safe? And so there's an element of scanning for safety, for trust, all of those types of things. But there is a whole nother element that we are evaluating a person. Am I better than them, or do I feel inferior? Do I feel superior or inferior with them? Now, as Jesus speaks in this passage, he says, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it, it will be measured back to you." Now, just before we go in any further, I do want to point out a few misconceptions or misinterpretations about this verse. Now, this is a go-to verse, and probably the most often when people mention it or bring it up, it's when they have been corrected. Oh, you've just corrected me. The Bible says, "Judge not, that you be not judged." So you have no right to correct me. Well, now there's a few misinterpretations. One is he's not saying we should not be people of discernment, because even later on in this verse, he talks about do not give what is holy to dogs and cast pearls before swine. So he's saying recognize certain things. In verse 15, it mentions beware of false prophets. So he's saying recognize when somebody is not teaching truth. So we have to have discernment. Also, what he is saying is he's not saying never offer correction. Because, well, in just a moment, in this passage, the phrase that we just read, he mentions about taking the plank out of our own eye. Then when we can see clearly, then we can offer help in taking the speck out of another person's eyes. What he is teaching is the order and the intention, or the order and how strong we come at it. The problem is we like to judge others and never judge ourselves. And we like to judge others at the highest standard to avoid judging ourselves. And Jesus says, no, that needs to be flipped around. We need to judge ourselves first at the highest standard, and then when we have dealt with ourselves, then we may be able to help somebody out. But when we have dealt with ourselves, we may recognize what they're dealing with may not be as bad as what I originally tried to point out in the first place. As we think about that phrase, judge not, why do we judge? Why are we critical of other people? And what is amazing is how strong of criticism we can give. Say you're sitting at home. You're watching, Britain's Got Talent. And what is the whole point of the show? Seeing whether they're good or bad. And we sit there judging and we critique them. And when a person doesn't do a good job, we think, man, they were awful. But when was the last time you tried to sign up to do a talent show? We watch a football match and somebody has a free kick at the end and they miss the goal. They lose the game. And you think, come on, it was a free kick. But when was the last time you had the opportunity to have a free kick in front of thousands? No, we don't even have skill close enough to what they have. And yet we feel we have the right to criticize them and judge them because they failed once in an area we could never succeed in or in the first place. And there's so many things. Politicians, we all could set the world straight if we were in that position, right? But why aren't we? There's probably a reason we're not. And we're probably better off as a world for me not being in that position. But it is so easy to criticize everybody else. But what is that? And what is the reason for that? It is to take everybody's eyes off of me and look at the problems of everybody else. And do you know, which is easier, to find fault in other people or find fault in ourselves? It's always easier to find fault in other people. And you know what? As we find fault in other people, we look down on them, we feel better about ourselves, and you know what the best part about it? I don't have to do anything to change anything about myself. Right? As long as we can point out all of the flaws in other people, I never have to deal with self, and yet I can feel better about myself. And that's what Jesus is trying to point out and saying, no, that is completely wrong. Now, as we think about that phrase, judge not, that you be not judged, one of the reasons that we should not be putting ourselves in that position as judge is because there is only one true judge. Now, another misconception, some have taken this to an extreme and say there should never be a judge appointed by the government. There should never be a judge because we're not here to judge one another. Well, no, that's not what Jesus is teaching. All throughout Scripture, whether Old Testament, New Testament, there were judges within the system, if you will, in society, but what he's saying is we as individuals need to be very careful not to be putting ourselves in that role as judge because there is only one true judge. In fact, in Romans chapter 14, and I won't read through this whole passage, but really there was a division amongst Christians, and some would celebrate one holiday and some wouldn't celebrate the holiday. And all of a sudden, they would judge one another based on what holidays they would celebrate. Not only that, but they would judge one another on what they ate or what they didn't eat. Now, you had Gentiles and you had Jews. The Jews, they didn't eat pork. They didn't eat a lot of different things. The Gentiles, the non-Jews, they would eat pork. They enjoyed pork. And they would judge one another and basically their holiness and how close they were to God based on what they did and their actions or what they celebrated. And what Paul pointed out in verse 4, it says, "Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand." Now in verse 7, he says, "For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Verse 10, it says, but why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us shall give an account of himself to God. He says, be very careful about judging other people. Because every single one of us will stand before God and give an account to God. Now, even James mentions about, well, if you put yourself in that role as a teacher, you will be judged at a higher degree. Because if you put yourself in a role thinking that you know so much that you can judge another person, you're going to have a higher degree of judgment coming your way, right? And we see that in society. Those that don't show mercy, well, they don't receive much mercy. Another element that we have to be very careful with when we judge is we can only see the outside. We can't see the internal. We can't see the heart. We can't see the motive. And when it comes to judging ourselves versus judging others, we judge others by their external actions, but we always judge ourselves by our internal motives. My motive was right. But we don't give other people the benefit of the doubt, do we? A story, 1 Samuel, chapter 16. It's when, Samuel goes to appoint a new king. Saul had been discarded as king, and Samuel was set out to anoint the next king. Well, God told him to go to the house of Jesse, and when he arrives, he's going through the sons, and he first sees the oldest son. And he thinks, this has got to be the next king. Verse 6, it says, so it was, when they came, that when he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, for I have refused him. So Samuel, the man of God, as soon as he arrives, he looks at Eliab, the oldest son, and thinks, that's got to be the next king. He's tall, he's handsome, he's a warrior. He has got to be the chosen one of God. But then it goes on, for the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One of the things as we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, the entire emphasis of Jesus, which was completely different from any religious society. Religion places the emphasis on the external. Religion places the emphasis on the actions. But all through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is constantly pointing to our heart, making the changes within our heart. And as we consider this passage, and he mentions about not judging, in verse 3 it says, and why do you look at the speck in your brother's eyes, but do not consider the plank in your own eyes? We look at the speck in other people's eyes, and he calls out the plank, something very big, in our own eyes. But we try to avoid that, don't we? And as long as I can point out all of the flaws in everybody else, well, the more I do that, the less I even have time to think about myself. And the less I have time to think about myself, the less I have time to even think about my flaws, the more I can forget that I even have flaws, which makes me feel better, which makes me feel more superior over you. And the cycle continues on, and it leads to self-righteousness. But what Jesus is pointing out, so often, you see, we like to call out the little specks in other people's lives, but we are great at hiding our biggest flaws, aren't we? It's not just that we don't look for our own flaws. It's that we try to hide our flaws. Right? And as we go around, well, I can point out how people look and how they're dressed. And oh, you've got a little dirt on you, and you've got a little dirt on you, and you don't smell the greatest. But then, in reality, on the inside, this is how we look, right? But I can clean up real nice with a little jacket. Amara, when she saw me this morning, she freaked out. What's all over you? No. And I had to kind of escape without her thinking about it. But you know, on the inside, so often this is what our heart looks like. But we can put something over top, cover it all up. No one will ever know what I truly look like. And now I have the right to point out your flaws. And what was interesting, I went to Bible college, and when we went to class, we would always have to wear a tie. You didn't have to wear a jacket, you didn't have to wear a jumper, but you always looked smarter in a jacket. And you know, sometimes when you would see somebody, I think maybe the teachers would look at somebody, they'd see a jacket, and maybe they would show a little more favoritism or whatever, and they looked smarter, they looked better. But as a dorm student, I knew the truth behind it. Do you know why people wore a jacket? They didn't have time to iron their shirt. That was the reality. So it wasn't about looking better, it was covering up the wrinkles underneath. But it appeared to everybody else that they were better and they looked better. And you know, one of the biggest dangers of becoming a judge of other people is the more religious we become, the more we feel the right to judge others. In Jesus' day, the people that were the most self-righteous, the ones that placed themselves in a position of judging others, well, it was the religious leaders. It was the Pharisees. And they had worked out a way to make themselves appear so righteous. Even at one time, Jesus points out, he says, you even go to the length, you tithe on your mint and your cumin, your spices. Okay, somebody gives you some spices, and you cut off a 10% of that, and you give that. I mean, they were very exact when it came to their tithe. But he says, you show no compassion, you show no mercy. In one sense, you're ruthless with people, but you think you're so good because you cut off your tithe and make sure you give that. And they perfected in certain external ways, but their heart was never dealt with. And in one sense, the cleaner we get the outside, the less emphasis we place on the inside. And the cleaner we get the outside, the more we feel the right to call out other people when they have a fault on the outside. And Jesus says, be careful. He says the first thing we ought to do is look in a mirror, take the beam or the plank out of our own eye. Make sure our heart is right. And you know what? for most of us, that's a full-time job. And if all we did is just deal with our own self, so often we wouldn't even have time to deal with other people's problems. But also, when we deal with our own heart, we will see clearly when it comes to other people. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, it mentions about when somebody has been overtaken by a trespass, when somebody has been overcome by a sin, when somebody else has acted in a sinful manner. He says, ye that are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, in a spirit of meekness. Why? Lest you fall into temptation yourself. He says, yes, there is a time and a place to help correct somebody. But before you ever do that, look inside. Make sure you're doing it with a spirit of gentleness and meekness. Because otherwise, if the pride swells up in your own heart, you are capable of falling into the very sin. And even if you don't fall into the very sin that they're doing, you have already fallen into a sin of pride. You know, in one sense, the cancel culture. We live in a cancel culture. They've done something I don't like, and I'm going to X them off. But you know what? If everybody knew everything that we ever did or thought or posted, how many times would we be canceled? Right? But when somebody becomes famous, everything in their life is scrutinized. Everything from 30 years ago is pulled out. How many of you would like everything that you ever did between 15 and 25 years old be posted publicly? Probably not, right? There was a lot of foolish things that we all did. And yet, it's so easy to point out the flaws in other people's lives. Well, one, because nobody knows about my own flaws. And as long as nobody knows about me, I have the right and the liberty to point out other people's flaws. And Jesus says, no. First, examine our own heart. Then, when we have dealt with ourselves, which so often are bigger sins than what we try to point out in other people's lives, he says, then we will see more clearly about other people. There was a phrase that I came across as I was reading. And when you hear something about somebody else, our first reaction, especially if it's slightly negative, our first reaction is normally judging or critical, right? A phrase that this author had mentioned, and it was really about relationships, he says, use the phrase, I'm puzzled. Think about that. I'm puzzled. You hear something that sounds off. But using the phrase, I'm puzzled, there's a few different things that it helps us to realize. One, what is a puzzle made up of? Pieces, right? When you hear a story or information, how many of you think that that is the entire full story from every side? Absolutely not. You are only hearing a piece of the picture. Now, how big of a piece, we don't know. But you're only seeing a piece of that. And so, in a sense, by using the phrase, I'm puzzled, it is an act of humility, recognizing I don't have the full story, and because I don't have the full story, I am not going to jump to a conclusion or judge or be critical, because there may be information that I don't have that would complete my understanding, and then I would no longer judge. How many times have we jumped to a conclusion when we've heard something, but then we heard more of the story, and then it's like, oh, yeah, I understand why they did that. And so as I think about that phrase, I'm puzzled, I think that's something that would be helpful for all of us to put in our vocabulary. Proverbs verse 18, or chapter 18, verse 13, it says, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. If we jump to a conclusion before we hear the whole story, well, it's going to be foolishness, and it's going to bring shame to us. And so using that phrase, I'm puzzled, will help us to recognize I don't have the full story. And because I don't have the full story, I am not in the position to be a judge. So as we think about this entire passage, as it concludes, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. How do you want people to treat you? Do you want people to show grace to you when you mess up? Because we all will. Well, then we ought to show that grace to other people. First, examine our own heart. Make sure our heart is right. In one sense, as we think about this, there's a few questions we can ask. Where am I failing to live up to a standard I expect from others? Where am I failing to live up to a standard that I am expecting others to live up to? Another question, how do I benefit from the patience and grace of God? In what areas of my life have I benefited from the grace of God and His patience? And then a third one, really, who in my life can help me see my blind spots? Who could I go to and ask, hey, do you see something in me that shouldn't quite be there? And that takes humility. So as we think about this passage, judge not, that you be not judged. Take out the plank out of our own eye before we ever consider taking the speck out of somebody else's eye.